Oh, yeah. Are you sure? All right. Said not to look at the clock. I don't ever pay attention to that clock anyhow. Nathan, did y'all put up my PowerPoint for this morning? Can you go to the slides for me? I don't have the clicker, and I don't feel like going over where and getting it. Listen, I'm tired. I've been battling this cold all weekend, and then we lost an hour of sleep last night. I don't know what kind of craziness that's about. You'd think one of these days people would wise up and fix that. I don't think it's ever going to happen. Well, good morning. It is good to see everybody out this morning. Did everybody get a lesson sheet? All right. Before we get started in our class this morning, Gary, can I get you to lead us in a word of prayer?
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day that you gave us again. Thank you for the sunshine. We thank you for the rain that we've had recently. We thank you for the change in temperature. We can see the trees budding out and the grass greening up. Heavenly Father, as we study your word this morning, we ask that you would give us all focus and clear minds where we can think about the things we read and that we hear, and that we know what they mean. Heavenly Father, we know your word is true. We want to learn the truth. Heavenly Father, bless Roger as he presents your word. Heavenly Father, bless all those that are teaching this morning. Heavenly Father, we ask that you be with those that can't be here for whatever reason that they have. We ask this in your Son, Jesus Christ's name.
Yeah. Boys, if you'll just click that for me just a couple of times here. Click it to the next slide, and I'll make a comment, and we'll go to the next one. So we're working on this outline, Jesus the Messiah. We have been through chapters 1 through 7, talking about the revelation of the Messiah. And we saw the revelation by birth, by John, by his character, and by his teaching there on the Sermon on the Mount. Dale, go ahead and click the next one. And you can leave it right there. Thank you. Now we're looking at Jesus the Messiah, his authority of the Messiah. That'll go through chapters 8 through 10. And Lord willing, we're going to cover all three of those chapters this morning, which means we're not going to get real deep into things. We'll spend a little more time maybe on the teaching portion than we do on the examples that Matthew gives us. There's 3 sets of miracles that are recorded in chapters 8 and 9. If you'll look down through there, just a quick perusal, you see the cleansing of a leper there at the beginning of chapter 8. We've got the healing of the centurion's servant, and then you've got Peter's mother-in-law being healed. And so you've got those 3 miracles. And then you've got a section there that will talk about discipleship in a way. And then beginning in verse 23, you've got him calming the wind and the waves. You've got the 2 demon-possessed men being healed. And then beginning in chapter 9, you have the paralytic that is healed. So you've got those 3 miracles. And then again, you have a section that has to do with discipleship. And then after you get through that section, beginning in verse 18, you have the girl that is restored to life and the woman healed. That's kind of one miracle. I know there's 2 miracles there, but that's counted as one. And then you've got the 2 blind men that are healed, and then you've got the mute man being healed. And then you have more discipleship. And so you see in this section, it kind of goes back and forth between the miracles and doing something having to do with discipleship. But it has to do with the authority of the Messiah. If you remember, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, what was the reaction of the people?
Shocked.
They were shocked. They were astonished. Why were they shocked and astonished? Because of his authority, because of the way he spoke as one who had authority. And Matthew, it seems, brought that point out there at the end of chapter 7. And so as we get into chapter 8, we see Matthew trying to demonstrate his authority. And that's what we see in chapters 8 and 9, is a demonstration of the authority of the Messiah. So, number 1 there on our question sheet, and no, we're not going to read all of these things, but I do want to bring out some points here and there. Over what is Matthew showing Jesus authority in verses 1 through 17, and that deals with the first 3 miracles. Over what is Jesus showing his authority? We've got the leper being cleansed. We've got the centurion's servant being healed, and we've got Peter's mother-in-law being healed. What do all 3 of those have in common? It's physical diseases, all right? I had some notes that said it is authority over the unseen world, because, that's what disease is. You can't see those things. You see the results of it. But you don't see what is actually causing those things. But there's more to it than that. We saw him, if you look back before the Sermon on the Mount, back in chapter 4, at the end of chapter 4, I want you to notice verses 23 and 24. Jesus went about Galilee, teaching in the synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing all kinds of sicknesses and all kinds of disease among the people. Then his fame went throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all sick who were afflicted with various diseases and torments, and those who were demon-possessed, epileptics, and paralytics, and he healed them. So whenever we get to chapter 8, is this the first time Jesus has healed anybody? No. But this is the first time that Matthew has brought it to the attention, these specific examples. And so there's a reason Matthew is doing that. He is trying to point out these different examples, and there are other things that are in common with these first 3. Okay? But it does show his authority over disease or over the unseen world. Another thing that these 3 have in common is all 3 of these would have been people that were looked down upon. When you think about the leper, he was unclean, but what did Jesus do when he healed him? He touched him. He touched him. And that would have, in the eyes of the Pharisees and the leaders and their religion, that would have made Jesus unclean. And yet he had authority over them. What about the centurion servant? How was that looked down upon? Gentile. But what was Jesus willing to do? He was willing to go to the centurion's house. He would, for a Jew, that would have made them unclean. That was an abomination to go into a Gentile's house. And then what about Peter's mother-in-law? Why would she be looked down upon? This is something that we need to remember about Jewish culture. Women were looked down upon. Women were looked down upon. Whenever Christ came, he kind of liberated women in a sense. A lot of people say Christianity, stifles women's roles and all this. And no, Christ liberated women from that. See, Jews, they looked down upon the women, so women were not as important. And so we see all 3 of those examples has to do with people that, the religious leaders would have looked on and said, you ain't got to do that. Heal the people that are important. That's the way they would have looked at things. He not only showed authority over illness, but over what the leaders would look at as lowly. You know, talking about the touching the leper. I mean, the leaders would have been all over that if they had seen that. Going into a Gentile's house, things like that Jesus was willing to do. And even Peter's mother-in-law, sick with a fever, laying on the bed, and he took her by the hand. Well, that would have made him unclean right at that moment. And yet what he is showing, what Matthew is showing, is Jesus' authority over. Is he showing authority over the law of Moses necessarily? I don't think so. I mean, you might could argue that with with touching the leper, but with these others, no. He's showing authority over the traditions of the religious leaders, is what he's showing authority over. And we're going to see that theme as we go on through these. We're going to see that over and over. When we think about here in verses 16 and 17, notice what it says. When evening had come, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet Isaiah, saying, He himself took our infirmities and bore our sicknesses. So in this summary of verses, here in verses 16 and 17, and that's kind of what that is acting like, is a summary. It talks about his authority over demons. Now, how was it that he cast out demons? Matthew didn't just say he cast out demons. How did he cast out demons?
With the word.
With the word. With the word. Why is that important? Do you know anything about the practices of exorcism at that time? Let me tell you, they had a lot of concocted things that they did. I mean, they would burn incense, and they would have smelly things, and have all of these incantations and rituals and moanings, and I mean, it was a show and a half. And I'm not talking about just Jewish exorcism, but other religions. The exorcism of that time involved a lot of ritual. How did Jesus go? Out of there. With a word, cast out demons. Now, to the Jew that is reading this, whenever Matthew wrote, he cast out spirits with a word, that would have been a huge, flag right there for a Jew reading that, because they knew what was involved with exorcism. Jesus' authority over demons was obvious. All right, second part of that question, why are these examples important for Matthew's proof Jesus is Messiah? Why are these examples important? See, I thought y'all had caught on to that last time, whenever we went through chapters 1 through 4. Prophecy. It fulfills prophecy. Now, there are prophecies that talk about the Messiah healing the sick, okay? But Matthew doesn't bring up those prophecies. Look at the prophecy that he brings up here in Matthew 8, verse 17. He himself took our infirmities and bore our sicknesses. Where does that come from? Isaiah. We're at in Isaiah. What?
53:4.
Yeah, 53. Yeah, Isaiah 53 in verse 4. So in Isaiah 53, we have the image of the suffering servant. But that particular verse, they wouldn't have seen it that way. The Jews wouldn't have looked at that verse to be applied to the Messiah in that way. Here, Matthew is using that verse to apply the idea that the Messiah is going to take on or take care of their illnesses. And so the reason why Matthew is bringing up that prophecy is to show that applies to the Messiah. Now, he's going to heal the blind and the mute and all of that, and there's other verses, other prophecies in Isaiah that refer to the Messiah going to do those things. But see, he doesn't have to bring those up because the Jews know that that's about the Messiah. They know that those things have to do with the Messiah. Any thoughts on that section before we continue? All right, so directly after that, beginning in verse 18, we have kind of another section, and I debated on how to go about this because of the way some of the outlines lay it out. They kind of lay it out as in chapter 8 is this, and chapter 9 is this, and then chapter 10 is this. But if you look at the collection of miracles as being a collection of 3 at a time, then you can't do it that way. And so I did this section going through chapter 9 and verse 8, but understand we're going to kind of go back and forth on that too a little bit as we go through these questions. Read with me though in verses 18 through 22, because this is not a miracle. This is kind of dealing with discipleship. It says, and when Jesus saw great multitudes about him, he gave a command to depart to the other side. Then a certain scribe came and said to him, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus said to him, Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Then another of his disciples said to him, Lord, let me first go and bury my father. But Jesus said to him, Follow me, and let the dead bury their own dead. Number 2, what is Matthew possibly showing Jesus' authority over here? Now, I read that section so that that'd be fresh in your mind, but also keep in mind these other things that are happening. They were on the sea, the storm comes up, winds and the waves, they're afraid for their life. Jesus calms the sea. Okay? They get over to the country of the Gergesenes. They confront these 2 demon-possessed men. Jesus casts them out into the swine, you remember? And the swine run off and all that. And then they kind of run Jesus off from that area. All right? And then beginning in chapter 9, we have Jesus healing the paralytic who is brought to him laying on a bed. Okay? And so when we look at those examples, what are we looking at as his authority? What does he have authority over? Everything. Maybe in the physical world. Maybe look at it that way. So you've got things that are, disease, and then you've got things that are in the physical world. I have seen, I know Brother Will Handstein's outline. He takes chapter 8 and says that is miracles over the physical world. So you've got 5 miracles in chapter 8. And then he goes to chapter 9 and says that's miracles over spiritual, or our authority over spiritual. All right? And that definitely could be that way too. But it's just interesting to me the way that Matthew groups these together. How is that authority shown in verses 18 through 22? He has authority over the physical world, over everything.
Commanded them to depart from one side?
All right, they did that departing from one side to the other. I don't think that really plays a role in that necessarily. It's just kind of giving the narrative what's going on. Let me help you out a little bit. Instead of looking at this as authority over physical, maybe let's look at this as authority over priorities. Because in each of these examples, of course we see that in verses 18 through 22. You know, what is the priority of the scribe? Now, we don't have anything negative said about the scribe. He said, Lord, I'll follow you anywhere you go. But what does Jesus say?
That the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head.
Yeah. Essentially, he's saying, I don't have anywhere to go.
Yeah.
That's essentially what he's saying. You know, I don't have a home. Now, did Jesus have a home? I mean, he had somewhere he went back to. You know, Capernaum kind of was the place that he stayed, and he would go out from there and do his ministry. But he never had a home to call his own, like many other people would have. And so that plays a part into that. Now, you look at verses 21 and 22. What is this idea about, let me go bury my father? What's that talking about?
Put Jesus first.
What's that?
Put Jesus first.
Yes, put Jesus first. But what is this man wanting to do?
He's wanting to leave Jesus to go put his father first, and bury his body.
Okay, he's wanting to put his father first. And it appears to us in the 21st century that he wants to go bury his body's father, the body of his father. That's not what's happening. Okay. And so, and this is one of those things that, unless you go back and you look at the customs of the Jews and get into some of that, and I don't fully understand all of it either, but it's the idea that he had a responsibility to his family. Because under Jewish tradition, under Jewish law, they had to take care of their family. Especially until their father was passed on. Okay? And so it is unlikely that this man's father is dead. It's just unlikely. More than likely, what he's talking about is the idea that he needs to go back and stay with his father until that time that he has inherited everything, and then he can make that choice, he can make that decision. But Jesus is showing this authority over that tradition, over that priority in life. We need, and later on, he'll kind of make that idea come forth in his teaching. You've got to put him before family. You've got to put him before worrying about a roof over your head, things like that. If we get down into the episode here with the wind and the waves, what were the disciples concerned about? Yeah, being shipwrecked. They were concerned for their safety, were they not? And what is Jesus rebuking them over?
Little faith.
Little faith. Little faith. And so he's teaching them you need to have your priorities in order. Your life is not top priority. And he'll talk about that a little bit later in his teaching as well. In verses 28 through 34, we see these two men who are demon-possessed, and he heals them. How does he heal them? When he casts out those demons, where do they go? Into the pigs, into the swine. And where do those swine go? Off a cliff. Yeah, they're dead. They're gone. All right? Why is this an authority over priority? What happened when those pigs went off and died?
Their owner was out a lot of money.
Yeah, their owners were out a lot of money. The keepers of the swine ran into the city and told the people in the city what happened. Okay? And from that action, the people in the city all came out and asked them to leave. What did that pig keeper tell the people in the city? Did he tell the people in the city the wonderful miracle that Jesus did in casting out those demons from those two people? Or did he go into the city and he tell the people in the city, this man cast these demons into these swine and it killed all the swine? You see how you can tell something in different ways and get a different response? It's a priority issue. It's a priority issue. They weren't concerned over the fact that these two men who had been demon-possessed were healed. They were concerned over the loss of their pigs.
I always thought it's something just, they just had to say one word, go.
One word, yeah, go. That's exactly right. There in verse 32, Jesus only had to say one word, go. And it's done. In chapter 9, beginning there in verse 1, we have the episode of the paralytic lying on the bed. What does Jesus do with the paralytic lying on the bed? Tells him his sins are forgiven. Tells him his sins are forgiven. What was the reaction to that? Blaspheme. Why would they say you blaspheme? Because only God can forgive sin. But then what did Jesus do? He healed the man. And he healed the man for the purpose of what? To show that he had the authority to forgive sins. Okay? Now, could Jesus have just immediately healed this paralytic? Yes. And I would venture to say that in any other setting, probably he would have. But what we see there in verse 3 is the scribes were in that company. There were religious leaders there, and Jesus needed to make an example. He uses those things as a teaching moment. And so the Pharisees and the scribes, they needed to learn that he had authority for sure. But we see this authority over priority. What is more important than me being healed of my illness? Being healed of my sins. Spiritual healing ought to be top priority. And oftentimes with the scribes and Pharisees, that was not the case. All right. I want, again, we're going to see here in chapters 8, 9, and 10 this theme of discipleship. He's talking about those two disciples there in chapter 8. Here in chapter 9, verses 9 through 13, we also have Matthew being called and some things involved with that. And then at the end over here in chapter 10 is dealing with his disciples and sending them out. And so all of this has to do with discipleship, but it is showing Jesus' authority, the authority of the Messiah. Any thoughts before we continue on?
It's not just a miracle. Miracles also, you can read their thoughts.
Yes, absolutely. Not only was Jesus able to forgive sins, not only was he able to show the miracle of healing, but the miracle for the fact that he knew what they were thinking. Yeah, he knew what was in their minds, because if you'll notice, they said within themselves, verse 3, this man blasphemes. He knew what they were thinking. He knew what they were thinking. Anything else there? All right. Let's look at verses, beginning in verse 9, and this is going to go all the way through the end of the chapter, just kind of an overview. Here in 9 through 13, we'll read 9 through 13 in a minute. But in verses 14 through 17, he is asked about fasting. We'll talk a little bit about that. We've got the girl that is restored to life and the woman whose issue of blood is healed. the 2 blind men healed, and then the mute man is healed. At the end of the chapter, we'll read that whenever we get to that as well. But let's go back and look at verse 9 through 13. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, "Follow me." So he arose and followed him. Now it happened as Jesus sat at the table in the house, that behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and sat down with him and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard that, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." So question number 3, I kind of led you on a little bit to give you an idea of what's going on here. How does Matthew show Jesus' authority over spiritual matters? How does Matthew show Jesus' authority over spiritual matters?
Fulfilling prophecy.
Hmm?
He's fulfilling prophecy.
Fulfilling prophecy, there's definitely prophecy being fulfilled. We don't see Matthew pointing that out, but absolutely Jews would have seen a lot of the prophecies fulfilled here. But what do we see in these examples, these things that he's recorded? Calling out false teachers, there's definitely some of that in there. He's not, pointedly calling them out, but he's giving this teaching, kind of a general teaching, saying, you know what, you need to change the way you think.
He's communing with sinners. He's communing with sinners.
He is communing with sinners. Right off the bat, we see him communing with sinners. Who has Jesus chosen as one of his 12 disciples? Matthew. Why is Matthew important?
Tax collector.
He's a tax collector. He's a tax collector. Do y'all know anybody that works in the tax office? Anybody? I've never known anybody that works in the tax office. But, I think, generally speaking, people's idea of the person that works in the tax office, do we like that person? I don't like people taking my money, do I? Well, let me tell you something. For the Jews, it was a whole different level. The tax collector was looked worse upon than Gentiles, because the tax collector were traitors. They were Jews who were collecting taxes for the Romans. They were traitors to their own kind. Not only that, but tax collectors had a reputation. What was their reputation?
Dishonest.
Yeah, skimming off the top or off the bottom or both, or maybe get some out of the middle. Yeah. They were notorious for making money off of that exchange, that work that they were doing. And so the Jews didn't like them at all. And yet Jesus, the one that is claiming to be Messiah, and he has already claimed that indirectly, claiming to be Messiah, and he didn't choose any of the religious leaders to be his disciple. Who did he choose? A tax collector. Now, let me ask you this. Were there any religious leaders who were considered Jesus' disciples? Yes. Matter of fact, we just read it in chapter 8.
Nicodemus and Joseph.
Yeah, Nicodemus we'll find out about over in John. And who you say?
Joseph. Of Arimathea.
Joseph of Arimathea, yes, yeah. But look in Matthew chapter 8, verse 18, that we just read. When Jesus saw the great multitudes, he gave command to depart to the other side. Then a certain what? Scribe came to him, saying, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. Now, would he not be considered a disciple if he's going to follow Jesus? There were others too, and we could find evidence of that Jesus didn't choose those people to be his disciples, his 12. And we'll talk about the 12 here in just a few minutes. Lord willing, if we can get that far. This is a different thing. Jesus is showing his authority over spiritual matters because the religious leaders would not have done it this way. And for sure, they would not have sat down amongst tax collectors and sinners and had a meal. They for sure would not have done that. Now let's think about these other examples and how maybe they fit in that. Here in verses 14 through 17, and you remember a couple of weeks ago we talked about this when I was talking about fasting. The disciples of John came saying, why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast? How is this showing authority over spiritual matters?
Because he's directing who fasts and who doesn't. Or he's directing this the right not to, right?
All right, so he's saying that his disciples are not fasting now. Said they might later, or they will later. But they're not going to do that right now. What is this fasting we're talking about? Do you remember how many fasts were commanded under the old law? One. There was only one. That was the Day of Atonement. If Jesus is living the law, the old law perfectly, is he going to partake in the fast of the Day of Atonement? Absolutely, he is. Because he's going to live it perfectly. And so that's not the fast we're talking about. We're talking about these other fasts that the Jews traditionally are taking part in. And Jesus is showing his authority over that tradition. Okay? That's the same way with the tax collectors. All right? That was not an old law thing. That was a Jewish tradition thing. Jesus is showing his authority over those things. All right, what about the girl? We have the episode here. This girl has died. We have a rumor in verse 18, came and worshipped him, saying, my daughter has died. Come and lay your hands on her that she may live. And so he goes with this rumor. And on the way, a woman who has an issue of blood says, if I can just touch the hem of his garment, I'll be healed. And she does that. Look and see what it says in verse 22. Jesus turned around and saw her, when he saw her, said, be of good cheer, daughter, your faith has made you well. All right? And then you go on down and you see that he comes to the house, the ruler's house, and he sees the flute players and the noisy crowd that are wailing. And what does he do? He says she's asleep, but what else does he do then? Yeah, leave. Get out. Leave. How is this showing Jesus' authority over spiritual matters? These wailers and mourners were professionals. All right, you've got the flute players and the wailing and all of this stuff. This was another tradition of the Jewish culture. And these would have been paid mourners. We're talking about a ruler's house here. We're talking about paid mourners who would come and do this wailing and all this racket and all these things to show their mourning, their in mourning. But that was a tradition. That was not anything to do with spirituality in any way. It was just something that the Jews did. And so Jesus is showing his authority over that nonsense. That's what he's doing. Now, the woman with the issue of blood, probably Matthew is including that because that happened on the way. Not necessarily that it's under this same thing, but you'll notice what he says, your faith has made you well. Okay? And then you get down into the blind men, the two blind men who are crying out, Son of David, have mercy on us. What does that tell us about these two blind men?
They've heard of him.
They've heard. Yeah, they've heard. They believed. I love doing a lesson on these two right here. And the lesson, you could title it, The Blind Men Who See Better Than the Pharisees. Because that's exactly what we see. We see these two blind men, they know better about the Lord than the Pharisees and the scribes. All right? And so they knew who he was, they heard about him, and notice what it says in verse 29 again. According to your faith, let it be to you. Jesus is pulling faith into that again. So he's making sure that it is understood there are spiritual matters to be dealt with here. That's what Matthew is trying to show, it seems. Whenever we look at the mute man speaking, in verses 32 through 34, it says, as they went out, behold, they brought to him a man mute, demon-possessed. And when the demon was cast out, the mute spoke, and the multitudes marveled, saying, it was never seen like this in Israel. But the Pharisees said, he casts out demons by the ruler of demons. And so Jesus here is showing his authority over what? The devil. Satan. He's showing his authority over Satan. And we'll talk about the idea of what the Pharisees said here in a little bit. Jesus shows his compassion in verses 35 through 38. He's healing the sick while teaching and preaching. His compassion is over their lack of direction. Notice what it says. Because they're lost like sheep, scattered like sheep. He tells his disciples to pray for help in helping the spiritually lost. And that's the idea. He's not focused. Notice that the compassion is not focused on the physical disease. The compassion is on those who are lost. That's what he has compassion on. Any thoughts on any of that? Let's get that second part of the question. How does Matthew use these examples to show the Jews that Jesus is the Messiah?
It's all based on belief.
Say that again.
It's all based on belief and unbelief. It's not based on all this other mess. It's based on you believe him and you come to him. Well, that's true today.
Yeah.
That's not true here. Totally, that's true. He's in the presence of God interceding for us today. Those that come to him and believe him get help.
Right.
And those that don't.
There you go. All right, so we see here that he is focusing on faith. You have got to have faith. Now, in some other miracles, it's not recorded as though faith is involved in that. And I'm not saying that faith is not involved in that. But Matthew is pulling that out in these examples and showing the importance of the spiritual involved in all of these things. All right? But how does that show that he is the Messiah? I get tickled looking at the gospel accounts whenever I see how it's recorded, what Jesus does, and then the response of the religious leaders. Because you see that contrasted over and over. And I believe that's what Matthew is doing here. he is showing that contrast in such a way to the Jews that are reading this. They're going to see that and say, were these people stupid? You know? I mean, because it's obvious to the reader what's going on here. It's obvious the prejudice of the religious leaders against him. I mean, in verse 34 it says the Pharisee said he cast out demons by the ruler of demons. Now, if you were a Jew reading that sentence, would you not say, are you serious? Do you not see what this man, the great things that this man can do? And you're still claiming that he's not the Christ. I mean, at this point, the Jews ought to be saying, at least in their mind, well, maybe he is the Messiah. You know, but Matthew uses these examples, uses that contrast to show those things. Okay, we didn't get to chapter 10. Kind of expected that, but that's okay. Next week, we will go over chapter 10. Read through 8 through 10 again before next week. And kind of study that and see how those things are organized. Look at his teaching in chapter 10 and see how it's organized. A lot of times whenever we're studying Scripture, that will help us if we'll kind of see how, where does it break? Where does he change to a different thought? Kind of look at some of those things. Anything else? I know the bell's running. Yes, thank you.
I have a question. The 2 blind men that he healed, he
Yes.
sternly told them not to tell anyone.
Yes.
I would have been afraid to say anything. They would have told everybody.
So, Angel is talking about in chapter 9, verses 30, that Jesus, and their eyes were opened, and Jesus sternly warned them, saying, see that no one knows it. But what did they do? They spread the news. I mean, if you were blind and then all of a sudden you can see.
Yeah, but they had such faith in him that he healed them. I would have been scared of what he could do.
See, all right, so that's a good point. Angel's saying, I would have been scared.
He'd put my blindness back on.
Okay, you're thinking, okay, because he said he sternly warned them not to, so she's saying that they would have been scared to say anything because he sternly warned them. You might put the blindness back on me again.
Yeah.
I wasn't there. But obviously the emotion of these men, the fact that they had been healed, overcame what Jesus actually told them. Maybe there's a lesson in that. We shouldn't let our emotion get away from us and ignore what Jesus tells us. It did. He frequently told people not to say anything. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, there was a time period that he was telling them not to say anything, and then later on, it was fine. This is early in his ministry, and people have proposed different things as to the reasons why. A lot of that has to do with, we believe, that he doesn't want to stir up too much all at one time, because then he wouldn't be able to teach. And we see evidence of that in Scripture. But there's different reasons why he might have done that. It wasn't time, though. You're right. It wasn't time for that. Anything else? All right. Thank you for your attention this morning.